All right. Welcome to what I didn't think would be this type of a turnout. I don't know that I've ever seen Matt Klein even mildly nervous, but yeah, you get. So we're appreciative of the interest. We're going to have a discussion today. My name is Lee Calcote. This is Matt Klein.
Hello.
Well, we're here to, in some respects, this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but almost have the inaugural SIG network meeting, the CNCF SIG network meeting. Who's familiar with SIGs? This is not an unfamiliar concept. Kubernetes SIGs. CNCF SIGs. Same term, SIG. Matt, from your perspective, similar in purpose, not or more similar than dissimilar, maybe.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, very good. And so SIGs themselves, in part, I call out that this is a SIG because historically inside of the CNCF there have been working groups. Specific to this focus area, there had been a networking working group. Maybe arguably probably the most notable thing that networking working group had done is help steward CNI, Container Network Interface, sort of through the process of onboarding into the CNCF. And then it did some other things. It was a forum for vendor-neutral discussion and understanding of some cloud-native networking things. In the time that CNI had come into the CNCF, many months and a year and something has passed, and so now the CNCF has taken a step back, has grown by more projects than I have fingers, and is now has special interest groups. And so while CNCF SIG Network will take on some of the same area of focus that the networking working group has had historically, it is also significantly expanded in its scope of what we think we might be able to accomplish. We've written some things down into the charter of SIG Network in terms of what responsibilities we consider that it has, what topics of discussion that we think that we should spend time on and that we should facilitate, what existing CNCF projects that we consider this SIG more or less a homeroom for. Maybe that's the best way of putting it today. Everybody else had homeroom in middle school, high school kind of thing? Is this a horrible analogy? All right, anybody else here, a hick from South Dakota? Anybody else have a homeroom? All right, I guess that's just me. Well, for the uninitiated, homeroom is sort of the kind of home base at school where you go and sit down with your, anyway, there's something of a home and a purposeful forum of discussion for some existing CNCF projects that are already here. So CNI, CoreDNS, all of those that the term network, the broad term that is, sort of covers. So CoreDNS, Envoy, gRPC, Linkerd, NATS, Network Service Mesh. My Lord, that's a mouthful unto its own. And part of what we're hoping to do is with SIGs in general is to help more impactfully scale the CNCF Technical Oversight Committee. So of this SIG, Matt Klein is our TOC liaison. So SIGs themselves don't exist outside of governance of the CNCF TOC. And Matt is that representative and is well regarded in this space. Represents very distinctly one of the projects within here. And so I was pleased that Matt had come aboard in the first place to the TOC but also will hopefully make some of our focus a bit more elevated, more of a platform for some vendor-neutral discussion. There's a lot happening in this cloud-native networking space. Well, there really is. Part of that is our hope that, and an acknowledgement that there's a bit of a backlog for reviewing some would-be new CNCF projects. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself in part because I know this is sort of a cliched joke at this point, but seriously, if you go back and look at the timestamp on these slides, it's about 21 minutes old now. And that's mostly because they're a cut and paste from the charter of this SIG. So if you were to ask Matt, he'll tell you that technically this, okay, that's a 737 flying by, okay. This particular SIG is right in the process of being formed. It is essentially formed at this point in something of a formality that we would go off and have our first meeting. And as such, we would do that kind of in context of our mission statement and in context of what we consider the charter to be. So Matt had a heavy hand in articulating the mission statement here. We'll try to elaborate a little bit on the points here about providing clarity and informing. These verbs were chosen explicitly as opposed to things like dictating and governing. Those convey a different sense of what's trying to be accomplished. What's trying to be accomplished is something of a community and a vendor-neutral forum for open discussion around potentially conflicting interests, potentially conflicting ideas. Much of what this particular SIG is able to accomplish is in part, and are in large part based upon what it is that all of you bring to the table. We can, Matt and I can sit and meet and talk about some things, maybe make some decisions, and not really have those go anywhere if there isn't participation. There's a reason why Matt is holding a microphone, and that's because he's going to be soliciting your thoughts, feedback, input, things that you consider that you would expect that this SIG would take on, challenges and topics that it might address. Be thinking about that in the back of your mind as we go forth here. So we're intending to collaborate. There are already a number of networking-centric projects in the CNCF that need discussion and some collaboration. There's a Kubernetes SIG network that has done and is doing any number of interesting things, highly related things. There should be a purposeful relationship there.
Yeah, there's some basic things that this group will probably end up helping with, just in terms of scaling the TOC. We have a large project backlog. As was said, we need people with domain experience, to help do project reviews, help evaluate new projects. So I think those are table stakes in terms of what this group will actually do. So we'll be using our mailing lists and our project meetings to hopefully ask for volunteers to help with those tasks. Again, what I would consider to be basic tasks. But at least what I was hoping we could get out of this meeting, and I had sent an email to the list a couple of weeks ago, and we've had a couple of calls, which a few people have attended, is I think we would like to better understand what you all want this group to actually do. There are some basic things that we can do, and we'll definitely do those. And if that's the only thing that people want to get out of this, that's fine too. But if there are other activities, whether those be new projects that need to get developed, whether those be white papers to clarify complex topics that people don't understand, I think we're open to many different types of projects, but we would need feedback in terms of what would be asked for. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is. It is. Yeah, to reinforce that, if folks don't come to participate, it's going to be a bust pretty quick. So these are the existing projects that are sort of within focus. To Matt's point, the cadence that we're hoping to establish is probably every couple of weeks to get together on a Thursday to have these discussions. There is This is kind of the status of how the SIG is being formed, and the links to the mailing list, the links to a Slack channel inside the CNCF Slack to jump into, to begin to suggest some topics, to begin to ask some of those harder questions. There's a longer charter that we might want to bring up as a backdrop here, as hopefully each of you go to articulate what it is that you'd like for us to discuss.
Yeah, but I think at this point, we can just open it up. So if whether you want to just ask questions about what the group would actually do, if there's things that you would like to talk about that we would discuss at future meetings, I think we would like your feedback. So does anyone want to ask a question or open the discussion? I can bring the mic around. Don't all jump at once.
This could just be like a general SIG specific question, but one of the things we struggle with in SIG network a lot is an idea that encompasses like a ton of different things. And while you presented the idea to SIG network, it really touches like SIG node, SIG work, multi-cluster working group, yet to be named SIG. So you have to attend like 4 different meetings and explain the same thing over and over again. Do you think SIG network in CNCF terms could serve as a better meeting place to present those sort of far-reaching ideas? Or do you think they still belong in project-specific things?
I don't have a strong opinion on that. I'm personally a fan of less meetings. So if there can be a venue by which we can discuss, cross-cutting concerns, I think that makes sense. I think it's already been proposed that some of the work that's happening in other SIGs, whether those be Kubernetes groups or various other projects that are happening, that we could centralize those conversations. I think that's fine. I think the focus of this group at times can be, let's just make sure that all the right people are talking to each other, and let's make them an email list or a Zoom call or something along those lines. So I don't think this is really a heavyweight process, but there are lots of cross-cutting concerns in service mesh, in lower layer networking with IPv6 support, or dual stack or whatever, that probably span multiple projects. So sure, yeah. I don't know. Did you have?
Yeah, I think that's about right. In part, the answer is we're not quite sure just yet. In part because if there's an influx of discussions and topics that folks are looking to have within the group, that will also help dictate how frequently we meet and whether or not there are even subgroups to discuss some of those things more in depth.
Yeah, I mean, at a basic state, I think, again, what this group will do, it'll mostly be static until the TOC needs some input on either new projects or on project reviews. Like, I think that's the basic case of this group, and I think that's a really obvious thing that people need to do. But I think that, again, we'll be looking for people to bring other topics, that we can work on or help drive.
While you're thinking of your next question, one of the things that SIGs have begun to do is begun to be a forum for early review of upcoming projects. There's a SIG application delivery that is beginning to review sandbox project proposals. So, as such, so is SIG Network a potential place to review some of those things. Speaking of service meshes, just because it's a particular focus of mine, there's a couple of recent service mesh abstract specifications. As I say that, does any one of those come to mind for anyone? Announced last KubeCon, one was SMI, Service Mesh Interface. It was about providing a consistent set of APIs behind which you might interface with different service meshes. There was more recently an announcement of a different service mesh abstraction, and its purpose was much more, and it's called Hamlet, and it's much more for purposes of specifying a common way of federating heterogeneous service meshes. Not to get into the particulars of those, but to bring about an example of this network, or this SIG network providing a forum for discussion and potentially a forum for those specifications to come through and potentially come into the CNCF, if that makes sense.
Any other questions, points?
So I'm not actually sure if my question is correct for this venue or not, but I came to this mostly because I had not previously been involved with SIG Network. But in the role that my company plays in the Kubernetes ecosystem, one of the key things that's important to us is the performance delta between bare metal and running applications inside of Kubernetes, and network performance in particular is rather critical to that. So what is the best pathway for our company or myself personally to get involved in helping to drive performance as a key factor in the community that people think about? I think, at least in this community, most of the focus has been on interoperability, and performance has taken a back seat, and I think that's a barrier of entry for people migrating applications into Kubernetes. So,
And Mr. Klein might have a different answer to this, so I'll caveat it with that. But that's actually a particular point of interest for me, in that, what we all need is another foundation. I say that mostly jokingly, in that there's currently a new proposed Linux Foundation sub-project. It currently goes by the name of Workload Profile Definition and Measurement. And it is for purposes of, initially defining, describing how you would characterize a workload, how you would characterize the environment in which it runs, and then the manner in which you would do performance testing of the workload and of the infrastructure that it runs on. You can imagine that there are many infrastructure providers, big public clouds, that are intrigued by this and want to participate in that discussion. It's highly related to some things that we would discuss within SIG Network, particularly around networking. For my part, it's my intention to go take a service mesh performance benchmark specification into that new project and have that discussed and worked on as a specific area of focus. But it's one that I would desire for to be highly discussed. This is on the list of relationships to maintain and topics of discussion to have. That again, what Matt will chime in here, but for my part, the SIG Network is a wonderful and highly appropriate place to discuss network performance.
Yeah, I think perf is something that we should definitely tackle. The caveat that I would say with perf is that, in my own experience, it requires a extremely large time investment to do in a way that is not disingenuous. And I would want to make sure that any artifacts that we produce, that we can be proud of those artifacts, and it doesn't become a finger-pointing mess of numbers that can't be reproduced and don't have a lot of value. So yes, I think perf is a great thing that we should be talking about. And I would love to get some people together that can start actually working on that to figure out what we need to measure. Most importantly, how can we measure it reproducibly, which costs money? So there's a funding element. But yeah, I think this is a very ripe area of investigation. Yes, go ahead. We can repeat. Yeah. Sorry, yeah, so the comment was that they've done something similar in SIG storage. How can we bring it into SIG network? I think you should just come to our next meeting, and we can discuss it. I think there's a mailing list. I had already sent an email asking people what they would want to work on. So if you could even look in the mailing list history and maybe reply to that with some information, people will see it, and we can discuss over email, and then maybe take it to a meeting. Does that sound reasonable?
It does. It's
Yeah.
And again, sort of. There's a bit of history here actually, and it depends on quite what angle you're looking to measure on the network, or what that the CNCF a couple of times now has agreed to give some of the CNCF lab time for doing a performance evaluation of the various CNI drivers, the various CNI implementations. And this was probably a year and a half ago, and that there's still an appetite for that. And again, here recently, there are various things to go do performance testing of. I just mentioned service mesh performance benchmarking, and as a different vector from which to look at it. And to Matt's point, it actually, not done well, it can be kind of a sensitive thing to go tell a project that you're slow or you're fast or relative to this, but that it needs to be done in a transparent way, accurately. It needs to be done, and the thing is like while it might provide value at a point in time, 6 months later, well, maybe that's not the right value. Things change over time. So
we also have to make sure that we're actually comparing apples to apples, and that's the other big problem with these types of endeavors is sometimes it's hard to actually take two projects because they don't do the same things. So again, I think we're all in agreement. This is something that we should look into for sure. Anyone else have any thoughts or comments?
Well, while you're thinking, here's another section of the charter that talks about responsibilities and deliverables. Boy, I hate to sign us up for a bunch of work, but that's kind of what we're doing. That's what we're here for. Part of that is if you've looked at other working groups or other SIGs, some of them have put out white papers that hopefully help explain either a few newfangled terms that are relative to that technology space, or they've helped just give context to the area. So for those that have spent time in the serverless working group, or in, I think, SIG storage, or before they were SIG storage, they put out a white paper. There's a potential appetite for that inside of the SIG network. Also a potential appetite for kind of a sub, so there's the CNCF landscape, potentially a sub-landscape of that's expands a bit with respect to networking and traffic, those things. So other SIGs have taken on white papers, landscapes. Those are possibilities here. Due to Matt's point about solicitation, I guess I'll ask, maybe by a raise of hand, who would consider that a networking-centric, traffic-centric sub-landscape would be valuable? Thank you very much. Anyone consider that would be just adding to the confusion? Okay. Thank you very much. Maybe if you don't, a similar question around a white paper. So the white paper that I described is just one that characterizes the space, the need for discussions, the reasons why it is that there are projects focused on the space, sort of what it is that differentiates cloud native networking as a TM as a term and as a space, maybe potentially different from a term like SDN or from physical networking. So the question is, do folks feel like a white paper describing this space, maybe even some general practices in this space, would be valuable?
Would you be willing to work on it?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, we're taking sign-ups right up here. We've got. Yes, sir. I guess to finish that up, anyone consider that would be just kind of more of a waste of time and confusing? Okay, all right.
Yeah, so I'm more interested in the application in telco environments for traffic flowing. So are you also focusing on the what's and the hows, or just the hows? I mean, are you focusing on use cases, or just the projects and how they deliver the capabilities?
For my part, I think that those are highly interesting, that we had aspired to focus on trying to help facilitate producing some best practices and taking some use cases into context and just describing how those could be approached in context of the cloud native principles. So for my part, that feels appropriate.
Yeah, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't focus on both. Anyone else?
There is a telco working group, and how do you see the relationship between this, the networking SIG and the telco working group? I believe telco is very much about networking, and do you see them as complementary or overlapping, or what's your view?
Oh yeah, if you don't mind, I'll take a crack at it. For my part, that's a great question. That TUG, the telco, that group is relatively new, correct? I think that actually it was interesting because that group had formed in the time that the charter for SIG network was in flight. From my perspective, I consider it highly complementary and potentially, and certainly a group to have a relationship with, and as something of potentially of a subgroup, in part because you can have a lot of network-centric discussions with, if you put on a developer hat or an ops hat, and you can have a whole different set of discussions about networking if you put on a network engineer hat. And I don't know. So anyway, my point is like networking is deep and wide, and that it just even within context of the projects that will be within this SIG, if you take a look at network service mesh, you take a look at Linkerd, just as two examples. Boy, they talk about service mesh in dramatically different ways, and that's by and large because the folks are wearing there are different users for those. And so my point being, from my perspective, highly complementary because there's a whole set of conversations to happen that are service provider centric and that are network engineering centric as well. Network engineering in terms of like physical things.
I think what I would say is that these groups can be nimble. They're being formed to hopefully help the ecosystem and not make it more confusing. So I think that if we find over time that there's a ton of overlapping between the telco group and this group, we can potentially merge them. So I think we just need to see how things evolve.
So I'm just kind of jumping in. So it's an interesting conversation about wearing the DevOps / network engineer. Where do you see this group playing out? Because I guess I come from network engineering background, network architecture. I want to be a part of this and I want to be able to help. But at the same time, I have no no software engineering background. And I want to have people at my organization be able to participate and help out as well. But we're just learning and starting our whole journey with DevOps. So we're trying to figure out how do you incorporate people who don't have necessarily that background to further this journey?
To me, that's a super exciting question, actually, because you're one of 9 million others that are have that same perspective and story. That there's a bit of a bridge, or there's a bit of a gap to bridge, and that I'm excited about that bridge potentially being that gap being bridged in so much as a lot of the things that we are discussed within the CNCF are at their center, maybe discussed from a I don't know how, I don't want to put buckets on, but from a DevOps or from a developer-centric or a software engineering-centric perspective, but that, it's an exciting thing to me because it seems like we're missing out on that. There's a whole other world that isn't, another layer that isn't being discussed. We're missing out on that opportunity, and that either a white paper or some best practices or some use cases to describe and discuss, I think if done right, might be immensely helpful for bridging that divide.
Yeah, I mean, I would go even further and say that people with your perspective are very valuable to this because this landscape is incredibly confusing and fast-moving. So I think actually having people to come into the ecosystem and better help us understand what are the understanding gaps, like where is the documentation that's needed, and potentially to help with the documentation, like as part of the learning process. I think that's actually very useful. So that's what I would suggest, is just join the group and actually help us understand what you don't understand. Anyone else? Okay.
Hey Lee, so my question was, what kind of a cool logo can we have for the SIG?
Yeah, we're taking, well, who's got ideas? Cool logos, cool logos. What are cool logos these days? Are they're flat, I guess? Are they cute and cuddly in nature, or are they?
I have absolutely no idea.
You described a bit scope-wide. Scope-wise, you've described a bit of different places that this SIG could be touching on. Would you like to go into what you see as out of scope? What is not a good fit?
Yeah. So here.
I think we did have a section there.
Yeah, so hopefully this isn't contentious or isn't in conflict. I think what was, so Matt has been giving great responses. I've been trying to give specific ones, and Matt's been saying, well, in part, we're not quite sure yet. That will unfold over time. That, yeah, if you consider that many of the folks that show up for discussions have come from us, how should I say, there aren't necessarily, well, that there are too many of the same-minded, same-focused folks coming to some of these discussions, and that, for my part, I was excited when the other question was asked earlier about, like, hey, what does this mean for the network engineer? What's written here is about, speaking to, certainly networks don't function unless or none of the software runs unless it's running on physical things. I think what was trying to be articulated here is that if we're talking about the next ASIC design, maybe that's appropriate to discuss, because there could be a connection between if we're talking about speeds and feeds, or maybe that's less of interest. But Matt, would you characterize that?
Yeah, I think that, what's obviously in scope are the projects that we have in the CNCF already and those areas. So obviously that's service mesh, RPC, low-level networking adapters, those types of things. But based on this discussion, again, honestly, what is in scope is going to be the people that show up and what is the passion of people that are actually going to do the work, because this ultimately is all volunteer work. So if what is in scope ends up being perf, that's great. If what is in scope ends up being application programming patterns for networking, I think that's great too. So I just don't know that we can be actually super prescriptive about in scope, out of scope right now, when all of the SIGs are just being formed and we don't really know what work people are going to want to do and what questions people actually have. So my preference, just speaking for myself, is I would rather see the work that people are passionate about actually doing and who shows up, and then we can evolve, I think, what the group actually does and what is in scope and out of scope.
And maybe, I don't know if you'd had a premeditated thought there, anything that you consider maybe is sort of you wouldn't expect to see, or maybe better asked, things that you might like to see in scope that aren't listed, or?
I think it would be fair to say that if some of the contributors do come with a proposal that just doesn't, seems to be too disjointed, I'm certain that we would have found a more appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, at least from the TOC perspective, I think that's the goal, is to make sure that we have SIG coverage of various things, and we'll have to be nimble. So.
So daisy chaining off of that, it just seems to be a very interesting conversation because network engineering, things like that, we're cloud, but then we're starting to bleed into core, which is on-prem, and then things like that. And then we start looking at like, okay, we need to program stuff. We start looking at how do we have like open source routers? How do we do virtualization so we can kind of do service chaining without having to, we want to try to stay as open source as possible. So it's like, that's something I would be interested in, but at the same time, I don't want to necessarily say, we're trying to put other people out of business, but at the same time, we're trying to stick with the whole open source thing, so.
I think if you come to the meetings, you can help us decide what to cover. So, yeah. I think we're actually out of time, and I at least have to run, but
Yeah.
I will.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, speaking of, there's a book signing I'm running off to. So
But yeah, if people could sign up for the mailing list, that would be great if you're interested. And then there's the bi-weekly meetings, and that's a great place to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you.